Well, good afternoon if you are in cold, snowy New York. Good evening if you are in Berlin, where my engineer Johan has always been serving us so well. And good tomorrow. It is already the morning of Saturday, the 26th of February. So therefore, this is not only Fred Plotkin, that's in New Zealand. This is not only Fred Plotkin on Fridays, but Fred Plotkin and Thomas de Mallet Burgess on Saturdays. Thomas de Mallet Burgess is the general director of New Zealand Opera. And welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays and Saturdays on IDAGIO, the place where classical music happens. As you know, IDAGIO is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making opera and classical music available to fans all around the world. And I've been looking forward to having Thomas join us for a while because I've never been to New Zealand or Australia for that matter. I was supposed to work at Australian Opera 20 years ago, but 9/11 happened in New York and I chose to stay in New York City at that time. And I was sorry not to go down under, which is a silly term because down under is only a northern term. But if you are in New Zealand or Australia, what do people there say about everything north? Up over?
Over. I haven't really encountered it, actually. It's all relative, isn't it, Fred?
I think so.
It's all relative, and it's such a pleasure and a privilege to join you today.
Thank you. This brings up actually something that's very important about language and perception, that in the United States, where I'm from, you're from England. In the United States, when we talk about the Far East or Asia, what was meant typically was people from Japan, China, Korea, that part of Asia. Whereas in the UK, when you say Asian, it often means South Asian, in other words, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. In addition to Asia, the other word is Oriental, which we don't want to use anymore because Oriental means Eastern, but only if your view is Western. And I mention this because language is a way of forming attitudes, and opera is a way of forming and discarding of attitudes. Opera can install a point of view about something that we either have to accept and explore or maybe reject. So let's take a very simple example, but a very complicated opera. Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro is about everything. It's about relations between men and women, about the wealthy and the less wealthy, about people with power, people who don't have power, people, in the case of Susanna, who happen to be the smartest person in the room, but she doesn't have agency as a woman, as a worker. How do you, when you start working on an opera, because I should say that you are, in addition to running an opera company, a very experienced producer, as we say in America, stage director of operas all around the world. When you are asked to do a work, how do you open your door, your mind to that opera, and then construct your production and then impart that to others?
That's a wonderful question, Fred. In my role as General Director at New Zealand Opera, I am not only the organizational lead, but also the artistic lead of this company. And so one of the tasks that I have is to frame a vision for what opera might mean in our time and place. And for me, that's the key. I think of opera as relevant to the issues that we confront in our lives. And thanks to the incredible consciousness of composers and writers who are since long gone, but whose spirit remains and whose insights remain, we're able to access those and see how and in what way they're relevant for us, for our time, for our place. And of course, wherever we live, whether that's the Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere, there are many things that we share, far more things, I think, that we share than that separate us.
So I believe that relevant is a fraught word, because relevant, I think, can be used to discount anything older. To say, for example, that because Susanna is working for this man who's a Lechin after her and so on, and he feels that he can do whatever he wants, and his wife is unhappy, and Susanna works for the wife as well, that may not be relevant nowadays. And sometimes to make it relevant, a producer might do something such as make it an office and make the count the boss, the head of the company, and Susanna a secretary. That kind of translation that to me is not relevant, it's coincidental.
Look, I think that, yes, I hear you on that. I think that we have to get right into the spirit of the work, the spirit of its creation, and see what unfolds that is relevant for us. And that may mean discarding some elements of the work in terms of the emphasis that we put on those elements and bringing out others. I certainly don't think that dressing up a production in a different set of clothes is something that makes it relevant, and not in any way to disparage the incredible work that someone like Peter Sellers did many years ago, situating Così in the diner and Figaro in Trump Tower. Yeah. But and
Don Giovanni in Harlem.
Yeah. So that approach, that approach to time and place, I think had its moments and had its moment. And what I'm really interested in as a director is going down into the what I call the sort of metaphysical tensions within a piece. And in something like Le Nozze di Figaro, I start from a position that Mozart himself is a revolutionary, whilst if one looks at an opera such as Figaro, Susanna and the Countess find ways to have agency within the world that they find themselves in. And so much of that narrative is driven by women, which I think is a very modern lesson for us in a world where sometimes that is the case, but often not. And by encouraging the audience to look at those tensions, we may find ways of helping it to be relevant to our own situation. And if one looks at his other operas, even something like Giovanni, the idea of people coming together from different parts of society to challenge tyranny. Well, how is that not relevant today? It seems to me that whether we dress those characters up in modern clothes and bring it right up into the present, or whether we choose a different time in history or even the period of writing, those metaphysical concerns, if the production is directed in the right way and the cast respond to that, it's all going to have the same effect.
In my view, the hardest opera to stage by far of the entire repertoire is Don Giovanni. For any number of reasons. And I was writing about this yesterday. Viewers may not know that every year for WQXR radio here in New York, I publish, let's call it an analysis of the forthcoming season at the Metropolitan Opera. And if you go to WQXR.org, you will find my analysis. And the Met will be doing a new production of Don Giovanni next year. And I alluded to my concerns, not about the producer, Ivan van Hove, but just the fact that this is the hardest opera to stage. This is because, in my view, there are 17 scenes and 2 acts. Things move very quickly and it's all in the course of one day. There are many characters. I go back a long way with this opera. And speaking of New Zealand, I worked on a production a long time ago with Kiri Takanawa, who was singing Dona Elvira. And the way that producer saw the opera, the lead woman was Dona Elvira. And for a long time, she was the person that producers focused on. I think in our times now, the woman that they focus more on is Anna, because Anna starts the opera, the events that happen, the killing of the Commendatore, her father, happened at the very beginning by Giovanni. And therefore it's Anna's relationship, and Elvira is a different personality. There is Leporello, the assistant. There is Zerlina. There are not that many characters, but nonetheless, each one has to fit into the whole thing like connecting parts. And if a singer looks different, feels different, the whole opera changes. So the casting is incredibly crucial for this opera, because the conductor, the producer, all the members of the cast, the designers, all have to come to some kind of awareness of what they're after. And if they don't do that, this production, not the Met one, any production of Don Giovanni will not succeed. And
I agree with you, Fred. There are absolutely some works where the structure of the work and its resolution will save anything, virtually any production that is thrown at it. But Don Giovanni is not one of those pieces, and it requires an almost forensic level of detail in unpicking the thread of the narrative and how that is produced on stage, an agreement by all concerned. And I think one of the things, or you're absolutely right, it's a wreck of an evening. I think you're touching on something which is really important here, which is the collaboration and the nature of collaboration, and how challenging that is in opera, because we have these huge forces in any opera, by which I mean text and music and character and a narrative structure most of the time. And certainly three types of person: the director, what we call the director, we call the producer, the director, the conductor, and the cast. And those three forces need to have a way of working that opens up the possibilities rather than closes them down. And I absolutely love it when I hear conductors talk about not coming to rehearsals with a established idea about how things are going to run. And I love it when directors are open to respond to musical ideas, and performers, God bless them, being able to kind of effect some sort of alchemy that brings those two things together. Mm-hmm. That is the ideal. And I've encountered it a number of times, and where I have, it's the most thrilling experience for those in the rehearsal room, and that experience communicates itself directly to the audience.
So you are the head of an opera company, and therefore you would be involved in casting, but it's often the case that a director or producer would arrive at a theater being invited to create a production and then be told this is your cast, so that you might, at looking at your cast, decide that Anna needs to be more highlighted or Elvira needs to be more highlighted in their relationship with Giovanni. I think that, in my view, this opera is about the decisions that have to be made about Elvira. I think that Anna's clear, and if you follow the trajectory as written, and if you choose that path, then it's pretty clear where you're going. But Elvira is the one who is so complicated. And I will say to you, and I wonder what your experience is, every soprano I know who has sung both Anna and Elvira always say they prefer Elvira. And while I was an early Elvira-phile, I must say that I, in my study of the opera and through the years, have come to reside more with Anna. I don't know what that says, but the point in this, and then I want to know your input, is that we live with operas our whole lives, whether we work in the art form or whether we love opera and go to opera. And our first performance of Don Giovanni is not our only Don Giovanni. And whatever opera it is, but especially that one, we tend to gestate the characters, the issues for our whole lives. So as we attend new productions, we learn things from the productions and from the performances. But the question is, let's say you arrive at a theater and you're handed a cast. Do you then create the direction of this production of Don Giovanni, or will you have had ideas before?
The nature of piecing together an opera production means that it takes really, it's in effect a year to put together. So one might be contracted many years out, but effectively it's a year minimum. And that means that for productions, a set, costumes and other things need to be thought about, and to some extent building starts even before, and construction starts before rehearsals happen.
Of scenery and costumes.
Yes, so for that reason, for some years now, I will not direct a production where I have not been in a position to have a say about the casting. And that is for the reasons that you have stated, which is that if one is to have any chance at all of producing a piece that is synthesized into something that approaches extraordinary, that is a non-negotiable for my part, because casting probably is about 70 to 75% of the success of a production, not for the most obvious reasons of quality or capacity to sing, act, move, etc., imagine, but because how and in what way the production ties together is for me pretty crucial. And so that is a wonderful thing about the position that I'm in at the moment, that I'm able to effect that, not only for myself, for my own productions, but also crucially for the productions of other directors and conductors. And where that happens in a rehearsal room, whether or not I'm involved, it's hugely gratifying. There's an energy. I recently worked on Le Nozze di Figaro with a young conductor, Zoe Zeniordi, and
she's Greek, right?
Director Lindy Hume.
Yeah.
And I was, and Tracy Grant Lord, the designer. So three women coming at this revolutionary work, this, in my mind, proto-feminist work. Mm-hmm. What surprised me most about that collaboration was not so much that Lindy Hume would have a feminist take on that work, because that's part of her practice. And that was one of the reasons why I asked her to come and direct for us. But the energy between those three women in the rehearsal room was unlike anything else that I've seen. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you one example. Lindy talked a lot about La Folle Journée, the crazy day, which is the subtitle of that work, and how all of this happens in one discombobulation of a day. Mm-hmm. And Zoe was listening very carefully to that. And she made a change in her mind about how she was going to handle the overture. And she decided as a result of that she would take the overture as fast as anybody could possibly play it. And I have to say, there were not only raised eyebrows from the orchestra, but there were some very, very sore fingers and one or two disgruntled voices. But, you know, that opera opened with an overture that went at such a lick that instead of mentally speaking as an audience, sitting there going, okay, am I ready for my 3 hours of an evening? You know, it can sometimes happen with Figaro. You can wonder how on earth you're going to get through it. Instead of that, everybody caught their breath and went, oh my God, I better pay attention here because something is happening that I haven't seen before. And that sense really, through the wonderful casting and through the great production and the conducting, playing, That energy lasted throughout. And one of the comments that came back from many people was, my God, Figaro has never passed so quickly. And they didn't mean that in terms of just everything was fast, because it wasn't. You know, things really really extended and slowed down at different places, but that they were engaged. They were engaged at every moment of performance. No one was thinking about where they were going to go for a drink afterwards, or what they were going to cook for dinner, or had they got their supermarket order in. Everyone was attending to the performance. And that, for me, is what we need in opera. That attendance, full attendance to what is going on. And even though we live in an age of short attention spans, thanks to television and social media and everything else, it is perfectly possible for us as human beings to have that kind of transformative and transcendental experience in the opera house. But those people making that work have to take responsibility for that. And that responsibility happens at a micro level of collaboration, and everybody has to be prepared to shift.
Do you think audiences can be trained about how to attend an opera? And I don't mean don't unwrap your candies, but what I mean is how to listen, how to pay, what to pay attention to. Or is it really incumbent on the producers, the conductors, and the performers to put it over in a way that will engage the audience?
It's absolutely our responsibility. The audience is the audience in every day and age. It's absolutely our responsibility. And I'll give you an example of another production that I put together, which had as its remit another really important part of our strategic agenda here at New Zealand Opera, which is regional touring. And regional touring is very, very expensive. And here in New Zealand, there are 3 main cities and then very sparsely populated towns. So not necessarily places where you might expect large opera audiences. So I put together a production of Poulenc's La Voix humaine, the human voice in English. And instead of putting that on with an orchestra, I put it on with a piano in a hotel room. So the maximum audience was 20-25, depending on the size of the room. Mm-hmm. The distance between the audience and the soprano playing L was about 1 meter. And the piano was actually in the bathroom because it was the only place to put it. Neither the pianist nor the soprano could see each other. So we rehearsed back to back. So it was all done through feel, through hearing, through that sort of relationship between the two of them. And I appreciate that the human voice is only sort of 45-50 minutes long. But one of the things we were able to do in that room was explore what I'll call the authority of the score. So, and a good example of that would be dynamics. You know, if something is marked P in the score, piano, assuming an opera house of, say, 800 and an orchestra, what does that mean if you take it into a hotel room? And then if we adjust that, what does P, 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 P mean? And is it even possible to do P, 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 P in a hotel room and still sing on the voice? So, and what does that mean for the audience? Well, of course, dynamic is one thing that really connects in terms of emotion. When someone takes their voice down and you can only just hear it, you have to work. You have to work as an audience. You have to be present. And so in that production with, those key elements of dynamics, of color, of that we experimented with how to keep the audience absolutely engaged for every second, not to let them off. And it was a hugely impactful production. I think in part because, many times with opera, people engage with the spectacle, with the size and scale of things. But really, for me, the real goldmine is in that working those elements on a micro level and getting the audience hooked through their eyes, through their ears, and also kinesthetically with breath and with movement. But boy, those things are really intangible. And also, you know, to be honest, if you're a director going around and you know, and hawking your services, and you start talking like that to a general director, well, you know, there may be a few that will pick you up, but most want to know where, when, how, and what's the budget, you know. So if you're interested in that side of the work, you have to find people that are sympathetic to working in that way, and certainly here in New Zealand, that's one of the things that we pride ourselves on.
So let's talk certain practicalities for New Zealand. It is, from most places, very, very far away. It is, if I understand, 2 large islands, and maybe there are smaller islands. There are 3 major cities, which are Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch. It's on an earthquake fault, and there have been frequent earthquakes. There's another name up for it that I cannot pronounce. It means the land of long white clouds, and you pronounce it
Aotearoa.
Aotearoa. And that probably is the language of the Maori people, who are the indigenous people. I've discovered in my research there's also something called the Pacifica people, Pasifika. Who are they?
So yes, you're absolutely right. Pacifica people refer to people from the Pacific Islands, such as Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands, that are scattered in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. And yes, you're absolutely right. There are many, it's a multicultural society here. So Maori arrived from the Pacific many years ago, and so are the first peoples to arrive. As is the case in so many places, there was then a period of colonization and arrival from Europe, and arrival then from Pacific Islands, and the Tongans, Samoans, and other Pacifica peoples are related culturally to Maori. So, and of course, there's a very full and vibrant Chinese community here, as you might expect. So really a real mix of peoples. The other thing I think that is interesting about Aotearoa is that the Maori culture is absolutely fascinating, and one of the things that we do as a company is engage with the Maori worldview as part of New Zealand Opera, in recognition of a treaty that was signed between Maori and the British, that guaranteed participation and a say in the future of the country. Mm-hmm. So it's quite an interesting and pretty unique proposition, I think, in our post-colonial world.
Mm-hmm. And it's a population of 5 million. So I live in a city that officially has 9 million, and the metropolitan area of New York City is about 20 million. So the scale is entirely different. And if you are to present opera and be able to budget for presentation of opera in New Zealand, especially when you serve 3 cities, I believe the company was founded in 2000 by merging the companies from Auckland and Wellington, and then later the Christchurch company came in 2012. So those are very different obligations, and the scale is different. How do you plan? How do you budget? How do you think in terms of serving the 3 cities?
Yes, all very good questions, Fred. And, you know, I ask myself those questions daily, on a daily basis. I think that it's possible to produce opera in really interesting ways, reflecting different sizes and scales. But given that we are the only full-time professional opera company in New Zealand, we do, I think, need to present what I'll call main scale productions with the full orchestral resources. And whilst, you know, a full ring cycle would be way beyond those resources, many of the other standard works, Puccini, Verdi, etc., are within our grasp. And one of the things that we do have, as well as 3 excellent orchestras in the different cities and lovely theatres, are some incredible singers, many of whom live abroad in the US or the UK. And it's a great honor and privilege for us to be able to get them back. And so the quality of what we're able to produce with the resources we have is very high. However, we also have to recognize that it is an expensive art form at that level of size and scale. And within a country of 5 million, the funding for opera is limited. And the money that we are able to receive from benefactors and donors is also limited. And so we have to think very carefully about how much work of size and scale we produce. And then we need to think about our other remit, which is around touring regionally, around our whole area of bicultural engagement, and a really important thing for me, commissioning and developing new work. And so there are many different competing demands on that money, and audiences that may or may not be willing to go with the breadth of that agenda.
In a small country, in terms of population, everybody seems to know one another. I know you've worked a lot in Ireland, as have I. And Ireland has even a smaller population than does New Zealand. And Ireland has a huge diaspora. New Zealand has a huge diaspora. So there are people from New Zealand everywhere. I've known quite a few in the opera world elsewhere, not just singers, but also administrators. There was Sarah Billinghurst, who I've known for many, 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 many years. She began in the States at San Francisco Opera, and then became the assistant general manager in charge of artistic at the Metropolitan Opera. Yes. So she certainly raised the profile of Opera New Zealand as opposed to New Zealand opera in the world, and brought in singers from New Zealand, especially Kira Takanawa, but not only. And also Simon O'Neill, Donald McIntyre, who's a great favorite of mine. But when you are a small country, and everyone knows one another, often the heads of government are known to people. Jacinda Ardern has a terrific reputation in the United States. I don't know how she's doing in New Zealand, but she's very highly thought of here by those who know of her, and is held up as a model of good government and the right ability to communicate, and when to be serious and when to be more home-like. And have you dealt with her? Do you have any knowledge of her feelings about opera?
Jacinda, no. Like any politician, fortunes rise and fall, and I think you're absolutely right that she's received huge accolades around the world for how she handled particularly the early stages of the pandemic and her communication skills. I have had meetings twice actually with the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, which is a very important role, and had an opportunity to put across and to discuss the value of the arts. I mean, more generally, just an opera, but the value of arts to our economy and to our well-being and our sense of place in our community. And it's fantastic that in a country of this size, that sort of access is possible to have a direct conversation, which I think is really, really positive. But we also have to recognize that as everywhere, resources are limited. One of the things that has helped us hugely, because you're absolutely right, Fred, whilst people may come by New Zealand every now and then, and we have had a huge influx of people, including from New York, actually, coming back to live in Aotearoa, we've also been able to get our work out in the digital space. So in the early stages of the pandemic, I had planned to put together a site-specific production of Handel's Semele at the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Parnell, which is in the centre of Auckland, New Zealand's largest city. And this production was postponed once because of a lockdown, COVID lockdown. And then as soon as that lockdown lifted, we popped ourselves back in the rehearsal room and completed the project. And there were singers from all over, both from here in New Zealand and from other parts of the world, including New York, actually. A very fine Paul Whelan, who lives in New York and is a Kiwi, came to sing Somnus. So everybody stayed on. We got this production on, and we received a grant to have it filmed by a New Zealand director called Rebecca Tansley, who previously made 2 films. This film was edited and beautifully shot. And we then managed to send it round to regional cinemas. So it went round to 26 cinemas in New Zealand, and that was great. It was picked up by Sky Arts and broadcast in December. And then just now it's been picked up in Europe, and we have an organization that is currently organizing for it to be disseminated via television networks in Europe. And actually was featured in the Frankfurter Daily recently as an example of how opera film is changing, that it's no longer a question of just pointing a camera at the stage, but doing something that recognizes what film can bring to opera. And the response to that work has been absolutely incredible. The response of the audience, the live audience, was incredible, because the audience themselves featured as the congregation in the church. So in a way, it was an immersive production. They were participating in it at the wedding, well, the first wedding and the last wedding. But it's also been able to travel the world, and it features some very fine New Zealand singers. So that has been a route for us, if you like, out of our geographical isolation, and to meet the rest of the world. And I'm sort of very, very positive about that. And one of the things that we will do, because we're commissioning a lot of new work here, is we will try always and capture that new work in an interesting way, and then disseminate that so audiences get to see what we're doing down here that is unique and different to maybe some of the things that are happening in the rest of the world.
So New Zealand is famous for punching way above its weight as a filmmaking country. I believe Jane Campion is a New Zealander. She's an Oscar nominee, and is his name Peter Jackson of The Lord of the Rings? And I'm sure there are other filmmakers. And have you, as an individual and as a company, explored relationships with New Zealand filmmakers to perhaps create an opera on film as opposed to a live opera, but actually one purpose written for a filmmaker to then move from there? I'm not even going to go toward the Lord of the Rings stuff and Wagner and so on, because I don't want to. I prefer the Wagner, put very simply. But I think that there are stories that Jane Campion can tell, and maybe Peter Jackson too, about that are more operatic or opera focused, rely on the aesthetic of opera. In other words, where music takes over and speech does not count as much. Have you looked into that?
Yeah, it's a great idea, actually. It takes me back to when I first started sort of really engaging as a director with opera, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to commission a series of short operas for film? It would be really exciting. And in fact, at the time, I proposed that to Channel 4 in the UK, and it didn't really go anywhere. But yes, I have. I haven't been in touch with Peter Jackson, but I have been in touch with Jane Campion, actually, funnily enough, and other directors. There's a director, Lee Tamahori, who directed one of the James Bond films a while back, as well as a number of other really important New Zealand films here. And there is I think, an increasing interest about crossing that divide. And one of the things we're about to do, Fred, is we're because at the moment with the rise, a rapid rise in cases of Omicron in New Zealand, we're not able to be in the theatre at the moment, or at least we are, but the risk is very huge. We're looking at launching a nationwide competition to write and produce 5-minute opera for film. And that will be open to absolutely everyone, from the youngest through to the most experienced. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes back. I shall drop Jane a note, although I suspect she is, and I get the impression she is incredibly busy.
Yeah, she's nominated for an Oscar in a film that may win Best Picture.
Yeah.
I forget the name of something of the dog. I've not seen it.
I know, it's gone out of my head as well.
The strange thing in this pandemic era, I have not been to a cinema at all. And I've seen a few films, but I don't enjoy streaming films, so I've not really watched them. The Power of the Dog, maybe?
Power of the Dog, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's on Netflix.
I'm not a streamer. I'm not. There's something about a small screen and being in front of it, and it's not for me. I like cinemas. I love cinemas, and I love being in audiences. I think that's it. It's not so much the screen, but being a participant with other people that is robbed for me when I watch something on a small screen.
Look, I absolutely agree with you. There are periods in my life where I sit down and work out why on earth I ever got involved in live theatre. It's labor intensive, it's time intensive, it can go wrong at any particular moment, starting with the curtain, whether it goes up or not. And I come back all the time to that experience, that shared experience in the audience. What happens between members of the audience whilst sharing something that happens on stage or however it is staged. That is absolutely unique. And I think it's quite atavistic. I mean, it perhaps seems a bit trite to say that it goes back to sitting around the fire, but there is something really important that is shared in those moments. And it does happen sometimes as well in the cinema, but because but for me, not in the same way.
Yeah.
And there's also the question then, I suppose, of acoustic and voice, and how in opera, what is happening with the voice, at that level of the senses, including the kinesthetic sense, what is actually happening and that for me is very important. I started experimenting with very small spaces in opera when I was living in Western Australia, and set up my own company called Lost and Found Opera, which was about sort of less well-known pieces in found spaces. And really what I was exploring, Fred, was the connection that exists between a work and a space. So for example, I put on an opera that is very rarely seen by the composer Mio, Darius Mio, Mede, based on the Medea story, and I staged that in a place that was currently an exhibition, a sort of an arts center, but was previously an asylum for women, and was also a place where Japanese people were put during the Second World War. And it has and the place I found was a room that contained one of the original cells from those former times, and we staged it in a very small cell. And one of the things that I noticed in that sort of experimentation was that the opera voice at close quarters really still has the power to affect people at that material level. You know, you can really feel the voice going through you. Yeah. And sometimes I feel that as the art form has developed, and let's face it, oftentimes got larger, orchestras, casts, choruses, that I sometimes feel we lose that, depending on where we are, or maybe even where you're sitting. That we lose that, but it's really important, because it's one of the things that defines what is different. And so film is really interesting, and I think from a point of view of exploring stories and narratives and all the other elements that make up opera, it absolutely has a place. But I probably, like you, still come back to the incredible and extraordinary experience that is the communication between performer and audience on stage.
You spoke about Lost and Found Opera, and I was going to get to it. It's a movement that has had different forms, I would say, in the past 15 years. There have been a couple of opera companies in New York. One of them is called On-Site Opera, that tends to pick an opera and then find a not congenial spot, but a place that has resonance for the story being told. And the other was a much lamented company that was very innovative, but run a bit haphazardly, called Loft Opera, that really developed a whole generation of opera goers here. But Loft Opera would find these wonderful spaces and do their operas in the spaces, but On-Site Opera, which is thankfully still active, very specifically looks for places that have meaning. I know that you did an opera with Lost and Found called The Emperor of Atlantis, that had been composed in Theresienstadt, known in, I believe, the German or maybe the Czech as Terezin, and the Czech. And Theresienstadt was sort of the model concentration camp, if such a thing can exist, in that the people who lived there were often allowed to indulge their creativity. So operas were written and there was an orchestra. Vanessa Redgrave, some 40 years ago, played a character, I think, and this is ancient memory, Fania Fenelon, something like that, in a film called Playing for Time, about a violinist who survived by playing her violin at Theresienstadt. There's a wonderful book that I will commend to you called In Memory's Kitchen, that was gathered by a friend of mine, and gathered is the word. There were women in the camp who were upper class or upper middle class Prague women who continued their traditions of the coffee clutch, of conversation, without the coffee, without the cakes, without everything else. And they wrote things down that were a combination of memories and traditions that had been secreted out of Theresienstadt, wound up in Israel, lost for many, many years, until my friend Cara da Silva located them and edited them into a manuscript. And it has taken on now different forms. And it's that thing that you were talking about before, of gathering around the fire, of communication, of sharing experience even when the real experience is not there. And so I'm interested particularly, I should say too that a very famous product of Theresienstadt was a book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, which is a series of poems by children that were written. And then there was a musical version made in New York in the 70s probably, of I Never Saw Another Butterfly. So Theresienstadt has been a fertile source for art and the reflection of art in the midst of horror. So tell me how you approached this opera. What is the Emperor of Atlantis? I don't know it.
So the Emperor of Atlantis, or Der Kaiser von Atlantis in German, is an opera, as you point out, written in Theresienstadt in the concentration camp, and a lot of musicians, artists, intellectuals were put there, and it featured really as a bit of a show camp. So the Red Cross would come around, and the hospital would spring up, and flowers would be put in the beds, and the orchestra would play, and then many people were then sent on to the death camps. In fact, the libretto for the Emperor of Atlantis was written by Peter Keane on the back of the deportation cards in the camp. The story is very simple. There is a power-crazy emperor who takes on death himself. Death goes on strike because the emperor is so bloodthirsty, and no one then can die. That removes the emperor's power, and strange things happen. Soldiers meet between trenches and fall in love, and so on. And the opera resolves because death makes an agreement with the emperor that death will be restored to the world, but the emperor will be the first to encounter death. And what's interesting about it, and I think the parallel is clear to some extent with who the emperor represents, but the last aria that the emperor sings before death is really moving. And in it, he talks about the fact that even though he is going to his death, there will be others like him that come along. So do not sit back and relax. And how appropriate is that at this time? Do not sit back and relax, because others will follow me in my footsteps. And the music is actually quite poignant. And I ask myself the question, this is written in this camp. How on earth does this character have such a moving and poignant aria at the end? Where is the angry, hateful catharsis, frustrated catharsis? And so that was a big question for me. I then went to see the rabbi at the synagogue in Perth, and I said, hey, I would really like to stage this opera in the synagogue. And we spoke about it for a long time. And he agreed. So we performed this opera on the bima in the synagogue.
Describe a bima. It's sort of a platform, like a stage in a way for the synagogue. It's where
yes,
the action.
I suppose, I was brought up in the Catholic faith, and for me, I think of it as the altar, but of course it's different. But yes, you're right. It's a platform there that has the focus really of the synagogue, but behind which is also the kind of, there's a store for all the documents and so on. So it is in a way a natural stage. And what I did was installed a burned out Volkswagen
Ah.
on that beamer, set amidst a sea of sunflowers. So it was both a poignant image and an horrific one as well. And we played the opera, and for many nights, and the cast made up and dressed the audience, you know, in the foyer, and the audience watched that before going into the. So it was again a very shared experience. And one of the things that happened, Fred, was that the staging the opera in that synagogue revealed to me a number of things. First of all, it revealed to me what the opera was about. And as part of my preparation, I went to services with some friends who were sort of helping with the project, including a lovely, wonderful man, Alex Cohen, who sat next to me and kind of explained what was going on. And I realized that one of the wonderful things about the Jewish religion is that it celebrates life. And, you know, as a Catholic, we're very obsessed with death and with resurrection. But I love this idea of celebration of life. And there was a moment that I realized that this opera, also being written in a place where people were expecting death, was also about life. And these people who were in the most parlous of circumstances and who ended up leaving and being shipped to the death camps, at that moment saw the value in life. And that was, for me, incredibly revelatory and poignant on a metaphysical level. And I kind of, and I felt the audience felt that too, because of course, many of our audience came from the synagogue, intrigued by what was happening. And so we were finding a new audience, a sympathetic one, but a new audience. And many people came who loved opera and wanted to see the opera, but had never set foot inside a synagogue. So by staging the work there, we were in a kind of strange way also affecting a community coming together at a time when there's also all sorts of controversy around religion and around politics. And so for me, it was starting to hit things on a metaphysical level, on a spiritual level, and of course, and importantly, on an aesthetic and entertainment level. I mean, in terms of a great evening out. And so I think it was a really an incredible project, and in a way, it gave rise to the idea for Semele in a cathedral, because of course Handel's work, Semele, has a similar tensions between the sacred, in this case, between the sacred and the profane. You have all sorts of adulterous sexual relationships happening in the opera, but also these incredible polyphonic choruses of kind of religious or oratorio base. And those two things clash. And I was interested in how they would clash in the cathedral, what sort of energy was created from that. So it follows a pattern of work, but I would encourage anybody who has an opportunity to see the Emperor of Atlantis to seek it out, because it's an incredible work and very, very moving.
Your recitation of that reminded me of two stories, but probably many stories. One of them is you have to picture yourself in a New York context. People who are not from New York wouldn't know this, but there's a neighborhood called the Lower East Side, which historically was one of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. And my family arrived there. Everybody arrived there. You went elsewhere, but that's where you showed up. And there was something called Yiddish Broadway, which was 2nd Avenue, which had a whole string of theaters and restaurants that went with it, and a very thriving, vibrant culture, I would say, until the 1960s, when those actors died out and people stopped speaking Yiddish so much. But I was taken as a small boy, and there was a bakery in the midst of all this called Moishe's Bakery. And Moishe made these traditional Jewish pastries, including something called kichel Kichl, which is, it goes with your tea, and it's a crisp thing, and it's a bit sweet, and it's not fancy, but you can have it with everything. It's like a universal bread. You can have it with meat, with cheese, just with tea. And Moishe was famous for making a very, very good one. And I knew him when I was a boy, but then when he was a much older man, until the place closed about 3 or 4 years ago, I went in there and I bought some quiche, and I said, Moishe, and remember, now old man with a beard, speaking with a thick Yiddish accent, I said, Moishe, this quiche, it's heaven. He said, what heaven? Never mind heaven, here, now, we live for now. And that point that you were making about life was expressed in that little moment, that he didn't want me to consider and define his baked good by heaven. It's in the moment. And that struck me, because it's kind of like, with the Jewish people, but not only, for centuries, people have been trying to kill off the Jewish people. And the joke is, we're still here. This passion for living is really something very impressive. It's not, I would never say about any religion or people that they're universally one thing or another, but this concept of life, l'chaim, in the Jewish tradition, l'chaim means to life, but it's also the number 18. So when we give out gifts of money to a child, it wouldn't be a nice $20 bill. It's $18 because we saved $2 and we're toasting to life. So $36, $54, and so on. And the other story is from an entirely different kind of thing. I worked on a production of Semele many, many years ago. And there was a very famous singer who I will not name, who sang the aria, away, away, iris, hence away. And her teacher taught her to say it away, away, Irish hens away, because somehow it was felt that she could get out the words better than those S's, iris, hence away, Irish hens away. And she sang it that when I was the person who had to be in the position of saying, no, Miss so-and-so, it's not Irish hens away, it's Iris, hence away. And I bring this up because we, in our profession, deal with the fact that sometimes singers are trained in a certain way by their teachers to do what might work better for the singer in terms of pronunciation, in terms of the passaggio of getting through a particular series of notes that may not be always congenial. Have you had to deal with artists who are trained in a way that they think they know best, but what it actually is a convenience to get them through the aria?
Oh, well, that's another really interesting topic. You mentioned Irish hence away. I once directed
hens, as in chickens.
Yes. Well, I once directed Semele in Ireland, funnily enough, and I worked with a wonderful tenor, but who, instead of singing "Trees Where You Walk" in that incredible tenor aria, one of the most beautiful arias I think ever, would sing threes. And we just couldn't get past that. And there was a whole conversation around, do you hear what you're singing? Because I'm hearing threes, and it's trees. And anyway, I can't remember now, it was so long ago, whether we ever got there. I think that the whole point of opera is that music is not a sufficient condition, it is a necessary condition. And there are other necessary conditions, including text. And the whole point about opera is that it establishes a paradox. It establishes a paradox on multiple levels. So on one level, music, on one level, music is a mathematical enterprise. You know, it needs a certain amount of time to set up and resolve its own tensions. Otherwise, it can't work. And that time has to sit somehow with how drama needs to resolve its tensions. And oftentimes they don't arrive at the same place. So you've got to repeat words or potentially find another way to make those two things fit. And that tension, for example, exists on a micro level. When you put text with music, suddenly it brings it down into the real world, doesn't it? We can all listen to a symphony and we can imagine whatever we want to imagine. But the moment you've got text, it's telling us to be in a particular place at a particular time. And it's having an effect on the, for want of a better word, the purity of that sound. It's messing things up. Consonants mess sound up, as do vowels. But that, I think, is the wonderful thing about it. And I find it incredibly frustrating if I have people in the room that think they need to do as well as people do on recordings. Yeah. That's why recordings exist. Recordings exist to show you what would happen if you're able to do an infinitesimal number of takes and extend certain notes artificially and so on and so forth. That's what it would be like if we, you know, had a bit of artificial intelligence helping us. But live performance is about the mess of it all, the mess of human consciousness and us trying to kind of muddle our way through this thing called life. And that's got to exist on that level. So I think there's real room for in the singing for this kind of visceral thing that is about that clash of different dynamics and worlds. And I thought perhaps that this was only a perspective that I had as a director. And I was chatting to a wonderful man many years ago, Peter Berne, who was previously head of music at the Wiener Staatsoper, and had retired to the country to really work his passion, which was bel canto. And Peter was a fierce defender. He traced his sort of, for want of a better word, opera genealogy back to Rossini, and his scores were incredible, the markings, and by multiple talents since Rossini. But Peter said to me, I don't think there is a word in the whole of the opera repertoire that wouldn't benefit from better enunciation and diction. And I've carried that thought with me ever since. One of the challenges, I think, for opera singers is that they of course need to learn from a very, very early stage in their training that it's not so much how they sound to themselves. And I encourage, one of the things I learned in the States when I was in the US for 4 years in Cincinnati, one of the things
you were at CCM, Cincinnati Conservatory of Music.
Absolutely, I was, yeah. And
I've taught there. It's a great school.
Yeah, a fantastic school, amazing school. And one of the things I learned was about the schwa, or the shadow vowel, and placing that at the ends of words so that the audience get what it is that you're singing. And I truly believe that in operas that are sung in English, that surtitles are not necessary where singers are able to use that device. It doesn't sound great to them, but to us as the audience, it just sounds really clear.
Would you define that more? Define that more, yeah.
The challenge, of course, is how to sing text and how to sing line. And that tension is something that people are at a very different place in terms of their technical ability, but also where they lie in terms of that dynamic between a purer sound and a more visceral kind of compromised sound, for want of a better word.
Then there are the aesthetic issues that are imposed by the individual opera or composer or style. So, for example, a number of years ago, I had the pleasure, and this really is a pleasure, of working with Joyce DiDonato, who I think the world of. And she had just come out of doing some Handel and was studying the componist, the composer, in Strauss's Ariadne auf Naxos. And she said to me that in Handel, you may have the same 4 sentences repeated for 8 minutes and with musical variations, whereas with Strauss, and therefore you had to fill it and make it your own and make it interesting for 8 minutes. Whereas with Strauss, in the same 8 minutes, he would have written 8 minutes of distinct music with a lot of words, and you had to, in effect, follow his markings to the letter, because by the early 20th century, that's how composers were working compared to 250 years before, when, as Joyce said, it's a suggestion. It's like a recipe. When I cook, ultimately, although there are rules in the recipe, it's a suggestion that you, the interpreter, the chef, then take in your different directions. Strauss, I think, I would say, had a more specific idea about what you, the singer, should do. So when you're working with singers on a production that come from different eras and styles, how do you factor that into the creation of their performances?
Really interesting questions, Fred, that you're asking today.
It's my job.
I'm so stimulated by our conversation. I think, first off, the thing to say is that there is an intentionalist fallacy that pervades opera. It pervades other art forms as well, but we're talking about opera. And that is that somehow if the intentions of the creators, the composer and the writer, were known, that we should in some way respect those. And of course, in a score, as you pointed out, as scores develop, potentially the markings and the way in which a composer might choose to reveal his or her intentions is more and more clear. But the fallacy in that is that were the composer to be in the rehearsal room, there is no guarantee that they would feel the same about the score that they had written back then. And in fact, every experience I've had with a living composer in the room as we have developed a work has been one of adapting to the people in the room, the situation, the staging, and everything else. And so why other composers who are now long since dead wouldn't be the same, I don't know. And in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that many composers adopted a very pragmatic view on what happened in the rehearsal room. So if we move beyond that, I think that it is our job as creators, conductor, director, and performer to question absolutely everything. And where we don't feel it makes sense within the entirety of what we're trying to create, to make our own decision and to run with that. That said, there is freedom in even the most pernickety of scores. And someone like Benjamin Britten, for example, marks his scores very carefully, dynamically, time signatures. But even within that, there are general pauses and rests. And also, I think the biggest tool the most important tool that a singer has is rubato. That ability to place a word within a section of music by literally buying some time in one place and paying it back in another place, so they still respect the overall architecture, is something that has been reduced to a bit of a stylistic tool rather than a key element of the singer's arsenal in making things appear fresh and alive. And I think that if we come back to where you started, some of those earliest scores are so exciting in terms of the breadth that they offer. Take, for example, a writer like Cavalli. When I first opened a Cavalli score, the thoughts that went through my head, and I was much younger then, was where the hell is the time signature? Where's the note value? How does this whole thing work? And then I realized that that was all for us to put together and to invent. And that was so liberating and exciting, and reminded me that probably where sung theatre, for want of a better phrase, started was with text and then some sort of vocalization being put to that. There's a theory that an amazing French work called The Song of Roland, La Chanson de Roland. There is a theory that that text was once sung, and it was the variations in rhythm and words that helped create variation in the music. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's an interesting idea as a starting point. So I think that even though sort of writers like Cavalli will offer that big breadth for a performer to really engage that relationship, much later writers who are more prescriptive, nevertheless, it's possible to get in there and find that sense of or that feeling of improvisation, as if something is happening and being made up at the moment. Of course, it's incredibly well rehearsed. Sure. But it's that illusion.
So what you're talking about in terms of getting into the real details brings up a practical issue in New Zealand and almost everywhere, that we in opera don't have as much time to rehearse as people do elsewhere. In the Broadway theater, for example, they will often have weeks and weeks of rehearsal and tech and so on, and then previews before they, quote, open. In opera, we open. We may have a final dress rehearsal with audience to get a sense of where the laughs land and so forth. But once we're open, we're open. And that's a very different challenge because things have to be done expeditiously, and you may want to dig deep into your character. And we're talking, of course, here about creating a new production, but what if you're doing a revival of the La Boheme that has been done many times? And in effect, all you're doing is bringing in a new Musetta and showing her how to walk around the set, and then you're on. I love the improvisational elements of opera and the getting on and just getting on with it, so to speak. But creatively, for you as a producer, director, where are the challenges in that?
There is absolutely no doubt, Fred, that extended time in the rehearsal room bears results. I have only ever once been in a situation where people were sort of questioning why we had so much rehearsal, and then they found out as we started to work things in huge amount of detail. But we also have to be pragmatic. Opera is expensive enough as it is without, and so you are very reliant on the preparation of everyone in the room and the openness of everyone in the room and our ability to collaborate and move quickly. One of the things that I learned when I was working at Covent Garden, and I worked with some amazing singers there, Thomas Hampson, Gabrielle Bacquier, Jennifer Lamour, Bruce Ford, incredible. incredible singers. And one of the things I learned was that when you are at the top of your game as a performer, you're going to do the same role all over the place, all over the world in different houses. It's just the way the business works at that level. And I realized that when noting singers that were that experienced in a role, it was almost like you give a note, and then it would be like one of those calendars that flips over, you know, those old filing systems that just go through the letters. You could see the cogs going in response to a note, and then all sorts of things changing: music, positioning, thinking, color, placing of a word would all happen, and within seconds. And that's because I think the role was so ingrained, was so part of that performer, that they were able to make those calculations in an instant, where someone singing the role for the first time would take much, much longer to respond and might even find that process quite overwhelming. The other thing I think is that the critical thing is that the performers take responsibility for their own performances. And I know I don't mean that to sound in any way negative, but I think at times the way the setup happens in the rehearsal room has reflected more of a patriarchal structure than another structure that might be more facilitative. And there are many examples of directors who are in effect autocrats and conductors who are in effect autocrats, and where performers who rely upon those figures for their living are sort of reduced to people who have to bend and move according to those iron wills. And that, I think, is to reduce the performer immeasurably. And where performers are able to take responsibility for their performances, and that means having conductors and directors who are facilitating them in that, then the work that happens behind the music and text, in other words, the subtext that just colors everything and influences everything, is going to have enough room and enough space in the rehearsal room to grow and develop. And I think that every time a performer encounters a situation like that, they grow and they breathe and they bring what is ultimately the essential life to the whole process. And where they don't encounter that, things are shut down very quickly, and it's very sad.
Well, there are performers who, more in the past than now, bring their Madame Butterfly, bring their Tosca, and everything is built around it. So Renata Tebaldi of the Glorious Voice would often have her staging and would not necessarily react in the moment to what was happening on the stage, but she would stand there magnificently and sing her Tosca and do the acting required, but did not necessarily engage with that production. Joan Sutherland, who I had the great pleasure of working with a lot, traveled with her own costumes, so that when she would show up to do Lucia, no matter what the production looked like, she had her Lucia costumes and lived her Lucia, which was an amazing creation, also through that costume. Now I don't think any singer could get away with arriving with her own costumes. Actually, Renee Fleming, for a particular production of, I'll have to remember, maybe Capriccio by Strauss, had her own series of outfits. No, it was Thais by Massenet. All these designers created clothing just for Miss Fleming. And she looked great and she sounded great, but it was not necessarily the clothing made for everybody else in the production, who included Thomas Hampson, by the way. This
Mm.
brings me to Tom. People know he's a good friend of mine for a long time. And I came to Adagio actually through Tom, who does a program called Thomas on Thursdays when he's not out singing. Originally it was on Tuesdays, so the alliteration made sense that Tom on Tuesdays, Fred on Fridays, and that's how we picked a day for me. But what Tom can do, because he's so sovereign with the music, is adapt to the production. But I've often wondered with him, if he's arriving to do, let's say, The Count and Le Nozze di Figaro, these are very different productions from here to there, but I always felt it was never his Count. It was the music he knew, but he always quickly adapted to and shaped the production that he was in. It's not that he only did what the director said, but he gave a lot of color and leadership, I think is a fair term, to the younger members of the cast. He's grown well as a mentor colleague, which is a whole other thing in the opera world that people don't talk about much, that certain people take on roles as they get older. And I don't mean roles in opera, but as mentors and colleagues, that they become sort of a beacon. There's another artist who I think very highly of, the mezzo-soprano Alice Coote, who to me has become a real symbol for a lot of people in the profession. She's not the best known member of the opera community to the public, but in the opera world, people look at Alice Coote as someone who is an example of how to live your roles and conduct your performing life. I need to wind up. It's been a pleasure. Is there anything I left out? I'm not in a great hurry to go, but I want to check that I covered everything. I want listeners to know that you gave a wonderful list of Bach and Handel and Poulenc and Jake Heggie and Richard Strauss, sung by Kira Tikhonova. I meant to ask you, you're the author of a book called The Singing and Acting Handbook. Tell me about that book.
It's a book that I wrote with a co-author, Nicholas Skilbeck, who is a musical director and a very good friend. And we found ourselves running workshops together when we were a lot younger and investigating this idea about what singing and acting is about. What are the skills that make singing and acting as a concept possible, as opposed to either of those things separately? Mm-hmm. So what are the specific skills that the performer needs? And in our research back then, we found that really singing and acting as a discipline was not being taught. And how and in what way were those things different for singing actors in opera and in musical theatre and in other forms of sung theatre? And so the book itself is really a workshop book. It's a series of tools that people can use to explore that. And since writing that book, there's been a huge explosion in literature and a shift in training in conservatories towards exploring that area. Mm-hmm. And I have to say some books that really do take where we were at and move them on. And I say this because our editors have been honored us for 15 years to produce a second edition, and I just cannot find the time or, to be honest, the money to be able to take time off work to be able to produce a second edition, which of course would reflect 15 to 20 years of work in the business.
But that's what the editors are there for. I've written 9 books. I know that if you don't get the money as an advance to write the book, you don't write the book unless it's really just something you feel you have to write and then you find the time. But otherwise, you get an advance.
Yes, well, even in this instance, the advance would not be able to keep me in my lush life, Fred. But so that work reflects a real passion, I suppose, for the art form. And I think that it's generally accepted now that opera singers need to come to the party with the ability to act and to sing. And we've been talking about some of that in quite a lot of detail, I think, during our conversation. So in a way, I think that represents the future of the art form, because we do need to think about that. Opera as an art form is under pressure in terms of its viability, certainly its viability outside major urban centers. And there's a lot of very good news, ideas, festivals, people that are taking us forward. But ultimately, I think it's around whether or not we can continue to interest people in the really special experience that can happen when everybody in the room is working towards the same point.
Including audience members, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I believe they have to bring something to the equation as well. Otherwise, it's a passive experience for them.
I totally agree with you. And I think that anybody who has sat in a live performance or been on stage or in the pit knows that it is the audience that make the difference. It's the audience ultimately that synthesizes all those elements. And we, all of us, have to trust that all that work we do in the rehearsal room, that it's clear enough to find its place in the audience, but the audience really make it happen. And where an audience realizes that, and it's easier perhaps to realize during a comedy and we all laugh together, you know, as opposed to a tragedy, but then maybe many of us are crying together. But where an audience realizes that role that it plays, you have one of those evenings that you never forget.
But I think in a tragedy or drama, you can feel the audience, whether you're on the stage or you're another audience member, and the degree to which they're engaged by it. Comedy, actually, of course, there's where the laughs land. And, you know, if a singer has allowed for a moment for a laugh to happen and it doesn't, that could be disconcerting. But with the drama, for example, the last act of Otello, you can feel it in the audience when it's being well done. And or a lot of Wagner, certainly. Actually, speaking of Wagner, one more thing before we go. You said that you cannot do a ring cycle in New Zealand. I have a ring cycle for you. I many years ago was working in Iceland at the Icelandic Opera, and Wolfgang Wagner, the grandson, fashioned a mini ring that he approved of because he could, that was done in Iceland and has been occasionally licensed by Bayreuth to do in small places where they can't do a big whole ring. And it worked pretty well. As you can imagine, the Valkyries in Iceland, it was the easiest casting call we ever had. But but I think that a Pacifica Maori ring cycle, the shortened version by Wolfgang Wagner, would be a very plausible thing that you could do in New Zealand.
Well, you're of course asking me to give away trade secrets, Fred, but
yes.
One of the things that I'm looking at very carefully is the Jonathan Dove ring cycle that is structured for resources that I think would be achievable, you know, here, and so that's something that I'm actively looking at for in my next three-year cycle.
Very good. I look forward to hearing about that. I look forward to having you back on to talk about it, and I look forward one day to coming down under, as they say, and exploring the world of opera in New Zealand. Thank you, Fred, very much.
If you ever came over up here or down here, depending on which way we want to see the planet, then you would be most welcome. And I'd also like to extend that invitation to all your listeners. You are most welcome here in New Zealand. It is an extraordinary country. You did forget to mention the volcanoes, but that is
and the sheep.
And the sheep. There are some incredible natural sights and walks and things. So it's a very healthy holiday, potentially, as well as, of course, being able to catch some amazing opera.
Yeah, very good. Thomas de Mallet Burgess, I'll say your whole name. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again.
Stay well.